A child in your household stops eating, not dramatically, just a quiet loss of appetite, the kind you'd normally blame on the heat, or a bad night's sleep. Then the fever starts, and with it a strange, specific ache, deep in the back, deep in the head, as if the pain has a location instead of just a feeling. 2 days later, small red spots appear on the tongue and inside the mouth. You've never seen this before, but somehow you understand, without being told, that this is not one of the ordinary sicknesses that pass through every year. Within another day, the spots move outward to the face, the arms, the palms, the soles of the feet, in that order, almost as if something is following a route through the body on purpose. By the end of the week, the spots have become raised bumps, then blisters, then something worse, deep pockets under the skin that feel, to the touch, like there are small round objects buried beneath the surface. There is no name for this in your language yet, because no one has needed one before. There will be. This is the sickness that will eventually be called smallpox, and if you are looking for the first virus that ancient humanity had to face at real scale, the one that shows up earliest in the physical evidence spreads along the first trade roads and kills with a signature you can still find on 3,000-year-old skin. This is very likely it. Let's be honest about the difficulty of that claim before we go any further, because it matters. Viruses do not leave fossils. They leave marks on bodies, mentions in texts, and occasionally, if we are lucky, fragments of their own genetic material trapped in tissue that happened to survive. That means naming a single first ancient virus is not really a discovery, it's an argument, built from whatever evidence happens to still exist. Measles may be older than we think, possibly diverging from a cattle virus called rinderpest sometime in the first millennium BCE, though some genetic estimates push that split earlier. Influenza almost certainly moved through ancient populations that lived close to birds and pigs, but influenza mutates so quickly that it left behind no fixed calling card to identify it retroactively. Herpes simplex has probably been with primates, including us, for millions of years, quietly, mostly non-lethally. None of these give us what smallpox gives us, a distinctive, preserved, physical signature on a body we can still examine today. That body belongs to Ramesses V, a pharaoh of Egypt who died around 1145 BCE. When his mummified remains were examined in the 20th century, researchers found raised skin lesions concentrated on the face, consistent with a severe pustular rash. For decades, this mummy was treated in popular science writing as close to definitive proof that smallpox was already an established killer in the Nile Valley more than 3,000 years ago. It is one of the most cited pieces of evidence for smallpox's antiquity, and it remains a striking, visible thing to look at. It's important to say plainly that more recent genetic research has complicated this story. When scientists have tried to sequence smallpox virus DNA from historical remains, the oldest confirmed genetic material recovered so far comes from far more recent centuries. And some researchers now argue the virus as we know it diversified more recently than the Ramesses evidence would suggest. So here is the honest version of this documentary's central claim. Ramesses V's scarred face is the oldest visible candidate we have for smallpox in the ancient world, a genuine and haunting piece of physical evidence. But the genetic picture is still being argued over by the people who study this for a living. Ancient disease detection is not a closed case file. It's an ongoing argument, and we are walking into it, honestly, rather than pretending certainty we don't have. What is not in serious dispute is that something moving with smallpox's signature symptoms was already devastating populations across the ancient Near East not long after. Around 1350 BCE, Egyptian and Hittite sources describe a catastrophic epidemic that swept through the region following a military campaign, one severe enough that it may have killed a Hittite king and crippled the empire's ability to fight. Historians still debate the exact identity of that outbreak, and some researchers favor other candidates over smallpox, but the pattern is the one that will repeat for the next 3,000 years, without exception. Armies move. Then the sickness moves faster than the army did, into cities that never sent a single soldier to the battlefield where it started. Think about what that meant for someone living through it with none of our vocabulary for what a virus is. There is no concept of something invisible, something that cannot be seen, stabbed, negotiated with, or burned out of a wound. All the ancient world has to work with is what it can observe. A person crosses a border, or a caravan arrives from somewhere else, and shortly afterward, people start to die in a very particular way. Fever first, then the mouth sores, which make eating and drinking painful just at the moment the body needs strength the most. Then the rash, moving in that same order every time, face first, then limbs, concentrating more on the extremities than the torso, a pattern doctors would later call centrifugal, meaning it spreads toward the edges of the body rather than staying close to the center. Ancient observers didn't have that word, but they noticed the same thing. This sickness has a shape. It behaves the same way in every victim, which is exactly what made it feel less like bad luck and more like a visitation, something with intent, arriving in a fixed order, because something was following a plan. The blisters themselves deserve their own moment because they are what set this disease apart from almost anything else in the ancient medical imagination. Unlike a rash that stays flat against the skin, smallpox lesions were often described as deeply seated, firm, almost as if something solid had been placed under the surface of the skin itself. In severe cases, the pustules could be so dense across the face and body that the skin barely showed through. And if the person survived, and roughly 70 to 80% of ancient victims likely did not, they were left with deep, permanent, pitted scarring, especially across the face. This is one of the reasons smallpox became such a uniquely feared disease across every ancient civilization that encountered it. Plague could kill you quickly, and, if you survived, often left comparatively little visible trace. Smallpox rewrote your face whether you lived or died, so that even survival came with a permanent public record stamped onto your skin for the rest of your life. In a world before photographs, before any way to describe a person except by their features, smallpox scarring became its own form of identification. You could tell, just by looking at someone's face, that they had already fought this war once and won, or that they had never fought it at all and were still vulnerable. That single fact, that survival left visible immunity written on the skin, is going to matter enormously later in this story. But first we need to understand how far this virus reached and how fast. Because unlike rabies, which mostly moves quietly from a single bite to a single victim, smallpox moves through the air, through breath, through the fine mist a sick person exhales, simply by talking or coughing near someone else, and through direct contact with the fluid inside those blisters or the crusted scabs left after they burst. That means smallpox did not need a bite, a bat, a dog, or a specific unlucky encounter. It needed a room, a market, a shared road, a trade caravan moving silk, spices, or soldiers from one civilization into contact with another was, without anyone intending it, also moving smallpox. By the time we reach the Roman world, the evidence becomes considerably harder to argue away. Around 165 CE, an epidemic now known as the Antonine plague swept through the Roman Empire, likely carried home along military and trade routes from campaigns in the East. Ancient physicians, including Galen, who personally observed the outbreak, described a rash covering the body, appearing roughly a week or so into the illness, sometimes dark and ulcerated, sometimes drying into a crust, that then peeled away. Historians still debate whether this outbreak was smallpox specifically or measles, or possibly both circulating together, since ancient medical description, however detailed for its time, was never built with modern diagnostic precision in mind. What is not in question is the scale of the devastation. Estimates for the death toll during the Antonine plague and its recurring waves range up into the millions across the empire, and some historians have argued it contributed meaningfully to a broader Roman decline, weakening the army, the tax base, and the administrative machinery of the state at a moment when the empire could least afford it. This is where smallpox, or whatever exact virus was riding through the ancient Mediterranean under that description, starts to look less like an isolated horror story and more like an active participant in world history. Diseases with this kind of reach didn't just kill individuals. They altered the outcomes of wars, the stability of empires, and the balance of power between civilizations that had never physically fought each other at all, simply because one population had been exposed before and the other hadn't. This asymmetry, one group carrying partial immunity from earlier waves while another meets the virus for the first time, is going to become one of the most consequential facts in the entire history of infectious disease. And smallpox is the virus that established the pattern earliest and most brutally. Ancient people were not passive in the face of this. Long before anyone understood what a virus was, observers in India and China had already noticed the pattern hidden inside the horror. Someone who survived smallpox once never seemed to catch it again. From that single observation, practiced apparently for over 1,000 years before it reached Europe, came a practice historians call variolation, deliberately exposing a healthy person to material from a mild smallpox case through a scratch in the skin or through inhaling dried scab matter, in the hope of producing a milder, survivable version of the disease that would then grant lifelong protection. This was not a modern vaccine. It carried real risk, and a meaningful number of people who underwent variolation still died from the deliberately introduced infection or unintentionally started new outbreaks in people around them. But it represents something remarkable happening astonishingly early. Ancient and medieval societies, working entirely from observation, with no concept of viruses, immune cells, or antibodies, correctly deduced the core mechanism of immunity through trial memory and pattern recognition passed down for generations. They didn't know why it worked. They only knew, from watching it happen again and again, that it did. That thread runs eventually all the way to Edward Jenner in England in 1796. Observing that milkmaids who had caught the far milder cowpox virus from cattle seemed to be protected against smallpox entirely, Jenner deliberately inoculated a young boy with material from a cowpox lesion and later exposed him to smallpox itself. The boy did not develop the disease. It is worth noticing the structural similarity to the rabies story here, the same shape appearing again nearly a century apart. A physician taking an enormous, ethically complicated risk on a single patient, built on centuries of folk observation that had already done most of the intellectual work, in order to convert an ancient, unstoppable killer into something the human immune system could be trained to defeat before ever meeting the real thing. Jenner's method eventually gave us the word vaccine itself, drawn from vacca, the Latin word for cow. Smallpox is not just history's oldest well-documented viral killer, it is also the disease that taught humanity the entire concept of vaccination in the first place. None of this made smallpox gentle in the meantime. For every ancient and early modern civilization it touched, it functioned as a kind of quiet, recurring tax on population, arriving in generational waves, disproportionately killing children. Since adults in a given region had often already survived at once as infants and carried lifelong immunity afterward, this created a strange rhythm across ancient cities, relatively safe for a stretch of years while a population's collective immunity held, then abruptly catastrophic again once enough new, unexposed children had been born to give the virus fresh ground to burn through. Ancient physicians, without our vocabulary, still noticed this cyclical pattern, even if they explained it through humors, divine punishment, or bad air rather than population immunity. The disease looked to them like it had a memory, striking hardest exactly when a city had let its guard down simply by growing a new generation. So, where does that leave the original question? Is smallpox truly the first virus ancient humanity had to face at meaningful scale? The honest answer, the one a careful historian or virologist would actually give you, is that we cannot know with total certainty which virus came first, because most ancient viral epidemics left no trace we can still recover today. What we can say is that smallpox is the earliest viral disease for which we have both a plausible physical body bearing its likely scars and a documented repeating historical pattern across multiple independent civilizations: Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Rome, India, and China, all separately describing something that behaves the same distinctive way. That combination, visible evidence plus independent textual confirmation across cultures that had no contact with each other, is rare enough in ancient disease history that it makes smallpox the strongest candidate we have, even while the genetic debate about its precise age continues among the scientists who study it. What smallpox leaves behind, more than any death toll, is a lesson about time. Rabies terrifies because of the delay between the bite and the symptoms, a private individual countdown running invisibly inside one body. Smallpox operated on a different clock entirely, a generational one, patient across centuries, waiting for populations to forget, for immunity to fade out of a bloodline, for a new group of children to be born who had never met it before. It is, in that sense, one of the first diseases in human history that a population could not simply survive once and be done with. It had to be remembered, generation after generation, in scarred faces, in burial patterns, in oral warnings about which villages had recently been touched by it. Long before anyone could see the virus itself, ancient humanity had already learned to see its shadow, stamped permanently into the skin of everyone who lived through it. And that shadow, may be the oldest handwriting any virus has ever left on us,